Hello and welcome to the IDP After Show with me, Jase Abbey. I'm here to bring you the Week 10 IDP preview episode where we'll take a look at a combination of the defensive players we think have some of the best and worst weekly matchups. As always, I will be joined on the show by one of the best IDP minds around, and I'm pleased to share that the person who is helping me break down what Week 10 has in store is none other than Mr. Scott Soltis, one of our team of wonderful contributors at the IDP Show. Scott, a very warm welcome to you. How are you?
Thanks. I'm doing well. I'm excited to be here. With what I usually do for the show, writing the defensive line streaming, I only get to talk about really deep end of the bench kind of players. So it's nice to be able to talk about players who most people actually have, or at least have heard of, and to be able to wade outside of the defensive line waters. Because in my leagues, I actually play all the positions, not just the defensive line that I write about. So I'm looking forward to this. It's going to be fun.
Likewise, I'm looking forward to talking IDP with you tonight, my friend. So as we do every week, we're going to discuss 4 linebackers, 4 defensive linemen, and 4 defensive backs. But before we get into those nominations, Scott, as we're at the midway point in this season, it seems only right that we have a quick chat about the front runner for the Defensive Rookie of the Year award, Jared Verse. I think, Scott, what we're seeing from him has been really impressive. And I had him as my 3rd ranked rookie in my IDP rankings as we approached the draft, behind Latu and Dallas Turner. And, you know, granted, he did have the best landing spot of the 3, in my opinion. But even so, he's exceeded expectations by some margin. Get this right. He has produced, deep breath, an insanely impressive 18.5% pressure rate, an incredible 26.5% win rate, which ranks 8th amongst all edge rushers. And we've seen him put up 39 pressures, 5 sacks, 28 tackles, 1 forced fumble, and a batted pass. I mean, these are mind-blowing numbers for any edge rusher, but for a rookie, it just makes it even more special. He's got this award wrapped up, right, Scott?
Yeah, I can't think of anyone else who's going to be able to really challenge him, even if someone goes on a really hot streak. Combination of questionable landing spots, injuries, weird playing time usage that I don't think we saw coming for a lot of different guys. So I think he's producing, and he's not like lucking into things. Like if you look at his underlying PFF numbers, and like you said, his pressure rates are good. It's not just he's lucking into some sacks and is going to have great sack numbers that aren't going to be sustainable year over year. So I agree. It's hard to envision, barring some kind of an injury or barring someone having the second half of the season like Will Anderson had in his second half of the season last year. Then I think it could get neck and neck. But I think, Verse has such a lead at this point. It's going to be really difficult for anyone to overtake him.
Yeah, I mean, who is in contention really? Latu, maybe Edgerrin Cooper, Quinyon Mitchell. These guys would have to perform at crazy high levels over the remainder of the season. And Verse, like you say, would have to pretty much be injured, I think, for them to be able to catch him now. And he is, like I say, at the beginning of the season, he was one of those guys who was producing a lot of pressures, but wasn't really producing the sacks. Recent weeks, he's just hitting his stride as well. So really makes you wonder what he's going to do over the second half of this season. I'm excited.
Yeah, and there are other guys who have been playing well, but the numbers just haven't really been following. So like Tavondre Sweat, I still follow the interior defensive lineman a lot because that's where I got my start in this whole IDP space. He's been putting up great PFF numbers. He's been playing very well, but the stats haven't really been following. And some of that we expected because he's a massive, huge presence in the line. And those guys outside of like Vita Vea or Snacks Harrison from years ago don't always tend to produce a whole lot in terms of actual statistical output. But yeah, Mitchell has been having a good year. Latu has been hit or miss. I can never figure out when to play Latu or when he's going to have that big breakout game that we all think is going to come at some point. Dallas Turner is a complete enigma, but I think it's understandable when you look at how well the other edge rushers in Minnesota have been playing and how much better of a landing spot that seemed like before we actually realized just how good Andrew Van Ginkel was and that Greenard wasn't a one-hit wonder in Houston for just a season. So, it's hard to imagine anyone barring some really unprecedented run to be able to contend.
Yep, I'm right there with you. So look, we've got lots to get through. So let's dive into these nominations now that we've put together. Scott, as my guest, you'll be going first, and then we'll alternate from there. And as always, we'll kick things off by discussing linebackers first. So please tell me which linebacker you are hyping for Week 10 and why.
Yeah, so this is someone who I don't have anywhere. So it was interesting to really do a little bit more digging, but it's Daiyan Henley for the Los Angeles Chargers. I know there was a lot of talk coming into the season about Junior Colson and the connection to Harbaugh. Perryman is still there, just not getting quite the snaps. But Henley has led the team in snaps every single week. So he is clearly the LB1 there. He has put up really solid performances. He had his best graded game of the season, according to PFF, last week at a 76.1. I'm sorry, that was the second best graded game of the season. So he's been performing well on the field from a watching the tape, breaking down analytics perspective, but he's also been fantasy producing. He has been a pretty clear LB1, regardless of what scoring system you end up using over the past 3 weeks. So he is a hot name right now. He's still criminally under rostered. I was looking on MFL before we hopped on to see if, maybe I'm just really late and everyone already knows to play Daiyan Henley. And I saw he wasn't even among the top 32 most rostered linebackers on my fantasy league. So that was surprising to me, given, the production that he's had, especially as of late, the snaps that he's been getting, the fact that he's been pretty consistent in there. And also the Titans just are a advantageous matchup for opposing linebackers. So according to the season-long metrics, they're the second best matchup for opposing fantasy linebackers, and over the past 3 as well. So sometimes those season-long metrics can be misleading if there are some real boom games early in the season. Maybe there was an injury on the offensive line, or a different quarterback was playing. It's important to look at Pittsburgh splits before and after Wilson, and to take those kind of things into account. But the Titans offense has been consistently allowing points to opposing linebackers, regardless of who is at quarterback. Again, second most season long and second most over just the past 3 weeks. So I think Henley is in a really good position to score this week.
Yeah, it surprises me that that rostership figure you mentioned there. I thought that would be higher. Maybe his IDP managers were scared off from rostering him more because of what Jesse Minter said about that sort of 3-man rotation that he intended on using to keep his linebackers fresh. And that is what we saw week 1, right? And then obviously Colson got injured. Henley started playing a little more, started playing a little less when Colson came back. But like you say, last 3 games, 80% or more of the snap share. And, maybe Jesse Minter has realized that Henley is the most talented linebacker on the roster, because he is. Perriman's very limited. Colson's not there yet. He's been very up and down when he has been healthy. So I for one, I'm pleased. I'm pleased to see things unfold as they are, because nobody wants a 3-man rotation. That gives us no linebackers we can start in fantasy.
No.
This week, 4 teams on a bye. Henley playing 80% or more of the snaps, 100% 2 games ago, and in fact, Colson was available for that game too. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah, and I think some of it's also a residual hangover from the offseason. We always get overly excited about rookies. So we all thought Junior Colson was going to come in, or Perryman as the more established veteran. Because like you said, Henley did not have a great rookie season. And then I remember all these weird reports coming about that Henley might just be kind of a different kind of guy, and that wouldn't necessarily mesh with Harbaugh, who likes, just a certain personality type. And so that it seems like that was all just noise. And outside of the very first week where you did see that 3 linebacker rotation, Henley, 90%, 100, 95, 76 is his worst percentage outside of week 1. So he has really consistently been their top guy. And it just goes to show you that there's a lot of smoke in the off season. And we know that a lot of times there's really nothing there.
Yep. Yeah, I'm right there with you. I've never really valued Perriman or considered him to be the kind of linebacker who I looked it up a while back, and he'd only ever played like more than 650 snaps once in his entire career. And I don't think that's only because of health. I know he's had his injury concerns, but I've always seen him as quite a limited player. I'm a Chargers fan, so I watched a lot of him in his first stint with LA and or with San Diego, I guess, at the time. And yeah, I'm not a big fan, but I did expect Colson to be commanding a larger role. And like you say, we do put too much trust, I think, sometimes in these rookies at linebacker. So lesson learned, won't do that again.
Yeah. Until next year. And then, we probably will. There'll be that new shiny toy, and we'll just have to, oh yeah, this is going to be the one that breaks the mold. Don't pay attention to Jack Campbell. Don't pay attention to Devin Lloyd. This is going to be that throwback to Kuechly and to Roquan and, those other, players who made that huge impact in their first year. It's all the rookie stuff is really tough. And I think patience, that's why I primarily play Dynasty. I love Dynasty and Best Ball. I love either having to exercise all the patience in the world or just getting all of that instant gratification with Best Ball. I don't really do a whole lot in between. And, guys like this are why. Henley, if you're in a shallow enough league, you might have cut him this offseason based on all the buzz and everything. And it turns out that would have not been a very prudent decision.
No, absolutely. I talked about it before on this show as well in one of the earlier weeks, but you mentioned there, Henley wasn't Harbaugh's guy and Colson was at Michigan, and obviously Minter's guy as well. But people, I think, do sometimes forget because they kind of saw Henley as this project. He hadn't been playing linebacker very long before he came into the NFL, not as long relative to some of the other linebackers in that draft. But he was a third-round pick. Colson was a third-round pick. It's not that unusual that we're seeing the second-year guy who's had a season to bed into the NFL emerge as the guy this year. Certainly, while Colson gets up to speed, but I see this as being those two going forward, and Perriman sort of falling by the wayside, and that's already what we're starting to see in terms of Perriman. His role is diminished fairly significantly, even in the course of just half a season. So yeah, I like this pick. I like this call. I'm a Henley fan. Did overreact a little bit when I saw his snap share drop below sort of 75, 76, I think it was 4 weeks ago. And I'm pleased that I've been proven wrong.
Yeah.
So my guy here is not as sexy a pick as yours, but Christian Rozeboom. And, once again, played almost every down in the absence of Troy Reader. There's no sign of that situation changing. Omar Spates, we all got a little bit excited about him. I was guilty of the same. Jacob Hummel as well. They both saw a reduction in their roles last weekend. I will admit, Rozeboom is a below average NFL linebacker, right? But his stat line against Seattle last week, 11 tackles and a QB hurry, kind of reinforces for me this assertion that snap volume is by far the most important thing for linebacker production. If they're playing poorly, yes, they may lose their role, but who really is behind him that we can trust? There isn't anyone there, I don't think. Looking ahead to this week, the Rams face the Dolphins. The Dolphins have allowed top 5 tackle volume to opposition teams this season. We saw that continue last week against the Bills. Dorian Williams, Terrell Bernard combined for 20 tackles. I think we could see Rozeboom approach or maybe surpass double digits this week on his own. So really, I guess, Scott, the question I have for you is, are you put off by the fact that he's not a stellar player, far from a stellar player, or are you two overlooking that point, providing he remains as heavily involved as he has been just recently?
Yeah, on a different defense, I'd be a lot more concerned about it. So if he had anyone even close to nipping at his heels, like Spates has decent PFF numbers, better than Rozeboom, but we saw, like you said, this huge decline in snap share from 1 week to another. I was one of the people who was guilty in one of my deeper leagues of going ahead and rolling him out as a starter last week. And I still ended up winning that one, but not by as much as I probably should have. So I think that PFF grades, we've seen a lot of, especially bad linebackers produce, I shouldn't say bad linebackers, but poorly graded linebackers produce from a fantasy perspective. Zach Cunningham was the poster child for that for a very long time. Devin White is another one who clearly fit that mold until they suddenly don't, and they're just bouncing around. So I don't know that like in Dynasty I'd be buying Rozeboom or going out to really actively acquire him, but I love that this show isn't focused on that. It's like, how do things look for next week? And for next week, I agree with you. He is a viable play. I don't know about at the end of the season, depending on which way the Rams season goes, if they do want to give Spates more of a look and Hummel more of a look. But I think for week 10, yeah, I think he's a very solid play.
Yep. Nothing to add there from me. You've nailed it. In Dynasty, I wouldn't want anything to do with him really, or very little to do with him, I should say. But yeah, for week 10, I'm all in. I'm all in. So tell us which linebacker you're fading this week.
Yeah, so a dynasty linebacker who I don't dislike as much, but week 10, I'm not a fan, is Dorian Williams. So I had mentioned previously, Daiyan Henley is not among the 32 most rostered linebackers according to my fantasy league. Dorian Williams is tied for 13th. So he is very heavily rostered. Some of that might skew towards some dynasty leagues and some owners wanting to roster him because of the youth. But I like him. I have him in some leagues. I wasn't as high on him coming out of college as others were. I had him, pretty deep on my LB list. I think I may have had him 6 or 7. And the first year, it seemed like I might have been right. This year has been going a little bit better. But if you really dig into his performance, you'll see one that he is the linebacker that does come off the field from time to time. He still played 87% of snaps last week, which is phenomenal. But he only played 63% in week 8. So, I'm not sure if he had a little bit of an injury. It seems like every Bills linebacker has been injured at different points in time this season. But if someone's coming off the field, it's been him this season. And if you look at his past 5 games, his on-field performance has just zigzagged back and forth. So 5 weeks ago, his overall PFF grade for that individual game, 78.2. Followed that up with a 47.3. Followed that up with a 71.1. After that, a 28.6. And then last week, a 67.8. So he does not strike me as someone who has a really firm command in that role. And if he keeps having this inconsistent play, if it starts to hurt the Bills, I know the Bills have been playing really well. I think in some ways they've been playing well in spite of some things. I don't think Bernard has been as good as we expected him to be this season either. I know Williams' season-long grade is actually a little bit better than Bernard, but he's at least playing 100% of snaps, so I like him better from a fantasy perspective. But the last thing I was looking at in terms of Williams was his matchup this week. The Colts have been a difficult matchup for linebackers. And this is another one of those where the Colts have undergone a lot of change this season. So I didn't just want to look at the season-long metrics. I wanted to look at last week as well. And I'm always nervous about using a single week sample size. But last week is about what the offense seems like it's going to look back like, because Taylor was back, Flacco was under quarterback, under center, and he's going to be there again this week. The Colts as a team, and I understand the Vikings have injuries, but the Colts as a team last week gave up a total of 3 tackles and 4 assists to all Vikings linebackers across 70 snaps for those Viking linebackers. So they're a tough matchup from a fantasy perspective. It doesn't seem like this is going to be a game where you're going to get 20 points out of both. It seems like a game where you might be able to get 10 out of one or the other. And I think the guy who's playing 100% of snaps is a lot more solid of a play. So in my leagues where I have Williams, I'm going to look at an Ivan Pace instead, or even though Levante David hasn't been as consistent as he had been for the past, it feels like 20 years in the NFL, I'm going to be looking at someone like him probably over Williams this week as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't disagree with the Ivan Pace over Williams thing. I'm a big Pace fan, but there are a few counterpoints with this one, I feel. And like you said, Williams had good utilization last week in terms of his snap share, and he had a really efficient game as a tackler, as he's had most weeks. And I think that's possibly the reason for that. And obviously he played well, or was produced well at the start of the season. Which is where he probably has that advantage over Henley, and maybe accounts for that disparity in the rostership. So there are those things which I think maybe reasons to like, reasons to be wary of at the same time. But as you say, that matchup is terrible versus the Colts. So I think he might be hard pushed to make the kind of impact he had last week against was it the Dolphins they played last week? He was, right?
Believe so.
Yeah, and the other concerning factor, as you mentioned, is that he's been so erratic in terms of his performances. I've seen this, and that makes me concerned. Given that, and this is the difference, I think, when we compare him to someone like a Christian Rozeboom. With Dorian Williams, there are a bunch of other guys on that roster some of whom have already started ahead of Williams at various points this season when they've all been healthy. Others who we haven't really seen much of yet. So that makes me a little bit concerned about him. So yeah, I guess in summation, after sounding like I was going to argue the point with you, I am kind of in agreement. Maybe I just don't dislike him as much as you, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think, when I was going through this exercise, I was trying to look at people who are tend to be a little bit more heavily rostered, or even just kind of going through my names and seeing, all right, who is someone I surprised to see where they are in my overall list. And so I still have Williams because I basically just ran my production model across all the players. I still have him as a tier 2 play. So I have him as a pretty solid starter this week. I just don't know that he's as good of an option as the level at which he's rostered. So I think in that tier 2, I would probably have him as like an LB2, LB3 this week in my rankings. And I think a lot of people are still considering him. I mean, look at where he's rostered. He's rostered at LB13, which is that, back end of LB1, high end LB2. I don't know about it this particular week with this matchup.
Yeah, I totally understand where you're coming from. And yes, I understand that. We don't often see, it's an interesting sort of tangent I'll go on, but we don't often see, especially at the linebacker spot, these guys that are massively erratic from one week to the next in the same way as we do at some of those other spots. So it does make me wonder that what's he going to be like when he does find that consistency? What kind of player can he become? The potential's obviously there. He's just not quite there yet. He didn't really play that much last season. We're only halfway into this season. I'm not offering this as a counterpoint to yours. I agree with you. Shouldn't be as high as LB13, but just an interesting point to raise. What can he become? I'm intrigued.
Yeah, because I think as much as I've liked Matt Milano and I drafted him really heavily this offseason in best balls, I feel like that's done. So he's going to get opportunities. I just think if he doesn't show a little bit more consistency, Balin Spector might get opportunities too. And Joe Andreessen's had that one amazing game in the preseason that made everyone learn his name. And I think he's maybe gotten like a dozen snaps so far this season. But if Williams doesn't shore up the play, and he's a young linebacker, so we've seen plenty of young linebackers take time to really find their footing. And some players, are in the right situation to be able to find their footing. This does seem like a defense that can sustain 2 fantasy viable linebackers. And so whoever is in that role is going to be in a good spot. I think it will most likely be Williams for the rest of the season. But again, a lot of the reason why he made this list is because it's a week 10 preview. If it was a rest of season, I don't know that I'd be dinging him. But given it's this particular week, I think he's maybe a little bit overvalued by people who look at like last week's production and think, okay, he's turned the corner. Given how much he has bounced from week to week, I would like to see at least 2 weeks in a row before believing that he's turned a corner and can be a little bit more relied upon.
Yeah, and to return and to end on the point that you raised when first mentioning him, the Colts are just a terrible matchup, one of the worst, bottom 3, bottom 2, I think. Looking at some of the John Macri charts that he puts out in terms of linebacker production, volume, and efficiency, that is. So yeah, every reason to sit him if you're going to at any point this season, this week, I think. So yeah, I like that. So my guy here, my choice for my linebacker fade this week is Jerome Baker, and I feel like I've picked some low hanging fruit compared to yours, Scott, for which I apologize. But look, I mean, Baker didn't play a single snap last week, while Kenneth Murray, Jack Gibbons played every down. I mean, yeah, perhaps Baker is learning the playbook still. He got traded a couple of weeks ago now, less than 2 weeks ago. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he became more involved going forward. But But this week, he just simply cannot be trusted. Until we see how this plays out, right? It's a no-brainer. Also, the Titans play the Lions this week. We saw Packers. Walker had a big game for them last week, but that was an anomaly. The Lions have been one of the poorer matchups for opposition linebackers in terms of tackle production this season. So for me, Baker is an easy fade. What say you?
Yeah, I agree. I think he's someone who has a lot of fantasy juice still, because people remember the Seattle days and think that that's going to happen again, and it might not, but I don't think, I'm someone who I would rather be a week late on someone than a week early, and this is one of those situations where once I see that he's out there, if I miss a boom week this week, I'm okay to miss a boom week this week and keep him on my bench until I see what his role is going to be and his utilization, and go from there.
Exactly. And to be clear, we're not suggesting people drop him or even trade him. Just don't start him until you know what his involvement's going to be. It just makes too much sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's switch focus to the defensive line, Scott. And I know, having checked out your weekly DL Streamers article, this is a position that you're both passionate and extremely knowledgeable about. So which defensive lineman do you think is in line for a big week?
Yeah, so I think it is Jeffery Simmons. So this is me not reaching too deep into the bag. He's someone who, back when I was putting out, 120 defensive tackle ratings a week last year, he was consistently near the top. A lot of people thought he was going to be the heir apparent to that DT1 role now that Aaron Donald is retired. He hasn't shown that, and I noticed some people were fading him in some of the redraft leagues that I play in. I've seen him on waivers, and as soon as he did, I snatched him up and held him because I knew that something like this was going to come. I've already mentioned T'Vondre Sweat once. I have mentioned him in my DL streamers multiple times. I think Simmons having a running mate there with him is certainly helping. But if you look at just the past 2 weeks, and I know, again, it's a small sample size, but he's been a top 3 defensive tackle across pretty much any scoring system and a top 10 defensive lineman. Oftentimes, whenever we think about sort of that sleeper mentality of defensive linemen, we think edge, edge, edge. And I understand that to some extent because snap counts for edges tend to be a little bit higher and a little bit more reliable. But Simmons is one of those guys who breaks the mold and really should be under consideration, even if you're not playing in a DT required league, over a lot of defensive ends or edges. So if you look at what he's done since he missed a game due to injury back in week 6, he has 15 pressures. And to put that number into context, as I was just talking about across all of the defensive linemen, that's third most among interior defensive linemen, but it's sixth most in the NFL. So he is putting up pressures at a rate that makes him a very viable play. I believe he's only converted 2 of those into sacks. So he's still a little bit under, he still has room for some positive regression in terms of converting pressures into sacks. I mentioned snap shares are sometimes something that will scare us away for IDL or for DTs. And that's going to get into my fade in a few minutes. But he's someone whose snap shares we don't really have to worry about. When he plays, he plays. His snap share floor this season is 73%. He's played as much as 86%. So he's one of those guys who stays on the field. And then finally, the matchup is one that I really like, with them getting the Chargers this week. The Chargers have given up the 3rd highest average points per game to defensive tackles. And as a Chargers fan, I'm not trying to rub salt in a wound for you, but they have given up 6 sacks to interior defensive linemen over the past 3 weeks. So that's something that I know Simmons just had a couple of boom games, and I never want to chase points. But when it's someone with the talent level of Simmons and it's someone with the matchup that Simmons has this week, I am very interested in chasing that. And then the last thing I'll mention is I mentioned the Chargers had given up those 6 interior defensive linemen sacks over the past 3 weeks. It hasn't been to teams that are anywhere near the caliber of Simmons and Sweat. it's been to Cleveland, and I like Dalvin Tomlinson. I wrote him up as a streamer last week, and he helped me out a lot in terms of my points average for that article. But before that, it was New Orleans, which doesn't really have a lot to write home about in terms of defensive tackle, and Arizona before that. So they're giving up sacks in bunches to less talented defensive tackles. So I really like this spot for Jeffery Simmons.
Yep, totally agree. I'm a big Simmons fan. He started slowly, as you said. No pressures at all first 2 weeks, and obviously no sacks with that as well. But we knew it was a matter of time. He was a buy low. Glad to hear you got him off of waivers. That especially if that was a DT required league or one that uses DT premium scoring. That's theft, Scott, and fair play to you. I mean, Simmons has proven over the years. You talked about a small sample size there, but over several years now, he's proven he's one of the best at the position. And it felt like just a matter of time before he'd found his feet, right? And that's what he's done in those recent games. And yes, I might be a Chargers fan, but I'm a very honest Chargers fan. And while that O-line has played pretty well at times this season, it's really the tackles that have played pretty well this season. That they are weak on the interior, and for that reason, yes, I'm all in on Simmons this week. Mm-hmm. For me, and sticking with this Chargers theme, I've gone with Khalil Mack in week 10, and I'm usually one of his bigger detractors, I suppose. I wasn't convinced that he could maintain the level of play that he had last year, and he hasn't. If we're honest, he hasn't played as well as he did last year, but he's still playing well, especially at the age that he is now, and he's still making an impact. The Chargers face, as you mentioned, the Titans this week, and although, Mason Rudolph's done a pretty good job of evading the pressure which has come his way, that Titans O-line is a little bit banged up. It's one of the first things I look at when I'm thinking about which defensive lineman to recommend on this show each week. And yeah, they are pretty banged up, and they've really struggled at the right tackle spot in particular. A third of all the pressures that either Levis or Rudolph have faced this year have come from that right tackle spot, which is pretty insane, and I think that's set to continue. They've got a couple of undrafted free agents they've been playing out there. Leroy Watson, John Ojukwu. I had to look these up. I'm not familiar with them because they are who they are. I think that's going to continue. Max spends more of his time on that left end. He does switch sides a little bit, but more of his time on that left side. So he's going to be facing the weakest side of that Titans O-line. I think he has a good opportunity to feast here, Scott.
Yeah, I agree. As much as I like the interior pressure, I think that Mack is one of those guys where criminally undervalued last year, maybe a little overvalued coming into this season, but he's getting the opportunity. He has the talent. This is a nice matchup, as you were mentioning. I do like to dig into those. My first cut is always to look at the fantasy points allowed by position, especially that fine grain for defensive ends versus defensive tackles. But that secondary thing of actually looking at who are they most likely to be matching up against is something that really, I don't know that we do enough of a job exploiting as much as we should, because you're right. Even on a good offensive line, there are oftentimes weak spots, and to just be able to look up how often a team has been allowing sacks tells you a little bit of the picture, but it's really trying to dig in. And, as someone who's watched the Titans a few times this season, my son's a big Will Levis fan because he got to meet him one time and he was super nice. So I keep telling him, okay, buddy, we might need to find another player soon, but for now we'll watch when he's playing. The offensive line, which I really thought was going to be a strength of theirs because they invested so heavily in it this offseason. But like you said, they're incredibly banged up, and especially when you get to that right tackle spot, and that's where Mack can just absolutely feast.
Yeah, it is. I will say it can be really difficult to think about this on an individual assignment basis because there are these edge rushers who stick almost exclusively to one side. There's other guys who will rotate heavily, and there's other guys who spend more time at one and a little less time at the other, and everything in between. So that can be really hard. And I think when I'm thinking about offensive tackles, guards, centers who are playing extremely poorly, especially guys who weren't penciled in as the starter to begin the year, there is every chance that they might not be the starter the next week if they've been playing particularly poorly. So it can be really hard to kind of like isolate who on an individual assignment basis is going to be lined up against who. But yeah, we have to go with what we've seen in recent games, and for that reason, yeah, I'm leaning into Mack this week. I think he could have a big game. So on the basis of what we're saying, we could see a lot of sacks in this game, right, Scott?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is
Simmons
nice.
And Mack.
This game has a lot of nice IDP implications, because I think I still have another player to bring up from this particular game later on when we get into defensive backs. So yeah, I'm excited for this. I don't know that the football is going to be the best in the world, but from an IDP perspective, it's going to be a fun one to watch the box score and the stat lines, maybe rather than the actual game.
Yep. Okay, so let's talk about the defensive lineman we dislike. Who do you think is going to let the IDP managers down out there this week?
Yeah, so this one hurts me because this is someone who has multiple appearances in that DL streaming article for me, and that's Grover Stewart. I like Grover Stewart a lot. I still haven't finalized my selections for this week, and he is just at that cusp. He is available still in exactly 75% of IDP leagues per MFL, so he's eligible maybe until the next round of waivers run, where I expect he'll probably go up over. I think he is a viable play, but I think that this is about managing expectations. He has been a top 10 defensive tackle this season. He had a huge game last week, only being eclipsed by Vita Vea's performance, but I don't know that this is going to be the week where you see another boom like that. I could see he's someone who tends to have a nice tackle floor, which I like for, maintaining you some level of points. But if you're looking for that defensive lineman play that has the potential for a 20-plus point kind of game, I know Stewart provided that to you last week. I know he is absolutely capable of providing that, but I am less confident in him moving forward this particular week than past. He did have great numbers, but he had efficient numbers because last week was his third week under 60%. And once you drop under 50%, I don't even look at you. When you get under 60, I start to get a little bit nervous. And I know that interior defensive linemen do a lot of rotating, but still, the matchup is also terrible for defensive tackles. They're playing the Bills this week. They have the 6th fewest fantasy points allowed to defensive tackles this season. And when you look at it on a game-by-game basis, only one team so far this season has exceeded their fantasy average when they play the Bills. So every team has been underperforming from a fantasy perspective when they play the Bills. That's not great. When you look at the totality of the IDP points that they've been allowing to defensive tackles, there have been 5 weeks, and I tend to use defensive tackle premium scoring because I love defensive tackles. But there have been 5 weeks where they have held opponents under 26 points across their entire defensive tackle room. And that included the Dolphins in week 2 when Zach Sealer was healthy, and you have Calais Campbell, who's designated as a DT there as well. So you have a really solid DT room. And the Seahawks, which are one of the most productive DT rooms, in part because I think they have 6 of them that are all designated as defensive tackles, between Leonard Williams and Draymond Jones, Byron Murphy, and I'm missing all the others. They traded for Roy Robertson Harris a few weeks ago, even though that really felt like strength on a strength. They were held to, under, I believe, 20 whenever they played across that impressive rotation that they have. So I don't like the matchup. I love his production lately, but I think it can also set people up to be a little bit misled into who he is, because he doesn't tend to be a big sack guy. That's nice upside. It's just hard to see this week.
Yep. You make a good argument, or several good arguments. In fact, you mentioned the tackle floor. That's kind of what we came to learn or understand about him, I guess, a couple of seasons back. But I was looking at 2022 when we had something like 67 tackles. Really nice number for a DT, right? He played more than 70% of the snaps in at least half of his games. This season, he hasn't topped that number even once, and that's with DeForest Buckner out for most of the season. I know they're very different players, but it doesn't help that Buckner's now back, and we're seeing Stewart's snap share dip to season low levels. So yeah, he's an easy fade for me unless I'm desperate for a DT. I wouldn't feel wouldn't feel horrible about inserting him into my lineups if I was really struggling, and if I was in a really deep league where there wasn't much sort of in terms of options for DTs on the waiver wire. But even then, I'd probably shoot for a guy with a little bit more pass rush upside than someone like Stewart. The 2 sacks was great. That was on 2 pressures. Like you say, he's just not a high sack guy. Good player. He's been underrated for a long time, but as a fantasy performer, I think we get a little carried away with what we saw in that. It was 2-3 seasons when he had solid tackle numbers. He needs the role, the snap share to go with that, and we're not seeing that this season. So yeah, I'm with you. I think there's reason to fade him a little this week.
Yeah, and I know we're focused on a single week, but he's a great example of why it's so good to move IDP assets. I know sometimes you can get burned. I listened to the show last week about all the linebackers that you've moved, and it's like, oh, it'd be nice to really have Alshire's consistency again and some of those things. But when you look at someone like Stewart, and when you see how high that snap share was 2 years ago and how efficient he was from a tackling perspective, those were almost unprecedented numbers. So he's someone that you could have sold out very highly. And then last year was a back to earth year that seemed actually like an overcorrection where he was going to bounce back a little bit this year. So that's part of the reason why I like doing, that's why I started writing up streaming defensive tackles, because I think there are always exploitable matchups out there and guys who are under the radar who, a lot of casual players may not have heard of. But yeah, Stewart, I think he's a solid player, but I think he's overplayed expectations these past few weeks.
And this isn't anything new, is it? We see this quite often with DTs who put up really high tackle numbers, and then same with corners as well to some extent. And then the next season they drop right off. Christian Wilkins jumps to mind. He had almost 100 tackles that one season, and then last year I think he barely surpassed half that number on a similar amount of snaps. So yeah, I agree with you in terms of the tackle production. I do tend to chase sort of pressures and sacks, pressure rate at DT, and hopefully I find a guy with pretty solid tackle numbers. I guess Stewart's teammate Buckner is a good example of that. He's a guy that I'd roster in as many places as possible. But yes, I'm with you on Stewart. Yeah. So I've gone with a defensive, defensive end, an edge guy. And I know this is really risky. So if I was picking low hanging fruit earlier on with Jerome Baker, I've made up for it here with Danielle Hunter, and it's risky. It's not lost on me that he's kind of putting together another extremely impressive season. 4 sacks in the last 4 games, a healthy 14.1% pressure rate. This one, Scott, it's largely about matchup. Hunter tends to spend most of his time on the left edge, which means he'll face a lot of Lions right tackle Sewell. And we know who Sewell is at this point. I was looking him up. Only 11.6% of the pressures that Goff has faced this season have been allowed by Sewell. He hasn't allowed, and this really impressed me, he hasn't allowed more than 2 pressures in a single game, and he's yet to surrender a sack. It's just insane. We're halfway through the season, right? I know Hunter's far better than most of the edges that Sewell will face on a weekly basis, and I know Hunter could find more success when he switches sides, as he occasionally does with Will Anderson, but even then, it has to be said, Taylor Decker has been a little up or down this year, but even he has only surrendered sort of 17 pressures through 8 games. So I think if Hunter's going to have a tough week, this is going to be that week. So Scott, tell me I'm a fool for going with one of the best edge rushers in the NFL still.
No, I don't think you are. I think I was just looking up one of the metrics that I really just discovered as I was getting ready for IDP bets with Johnny, was that PFF has some great breakdowns of the number of pressures that quarterbacks are causing. So one of the things that I wanted to double check is you were, because I know Penei Sewell is fantastic. I'm a Bengals fan. I still remember the memes of, draft Sewell and Burrow is upright, draft Chase and Burrow is on his back as Chase catches the ball or someone else catches the ball. So I am a big fan of his, love the talent. But the reason I want to do that quick check of Goff, he is not someone who runs into pressure. So you can have a great offensive line and a quarterback who just holds onto the ball too long, or, just the rookies in general tend to be pretty high in terms of those pressure rates and allowed pressures. Goff's not one of those guys. Tough matchup, good quarterback, smart quarterback. I think this one is this is definitely not a safe one like Baker was, because Hunter has been so hot lately and does have all the talent in the world. It'd be like saying don't play TJ Watt. It's like, it's hard to say never to play TJ Watt. And I think Hunter is kind of in that conversation with me where I'd have a hard time thinking of the options I would play ahead of him, even if it is a tough matchup. So, depending on what it is you're trying to get out of that defensive line spot, if you need floor points, I completely agree that he would be a fade for me this week, because I don't know that he's going to have that floor, and I don't think the probabilities of him getting a sack are nearly as high as some of the other guys if you're in a really sack dependent league.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I was remiss in not mentioning it. I mean, this isn't just for our audience's benefit. This isn't a start sit article. I'm not suggesting you sit Hunter. If you've got Hunter, you're almost. I can't imagine how shallow your league must be in terms of the starting requirements for you to want to actually sit Danielle Hunter. That's just not going to happen. But maybe you're like really loaded at the position, and you've like 4 or 5 of the top 15 defensive linemen. You've looked into it with a Jared Verse pickup or something like that. If that's you, then maybe this is the week when you prioritize one of those other guys. But yes, I like Hunter less than I like him ordinarily, I guess, is a better way of putting that.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I do like about this exercise, is that it's not start sit, and it's hard to sometimes switch off that part of the brain, because we think about, dislike Danielle Hunter, does that mean I should be sitting Danielle? No, that's not what you're saying, and it's kind of like it's not what I was saying with Dorian Williams or even Grover Stewart. It's largely about expectations and guys that we think might have a harder time putting up the kinds of numbers that we really want to see, in some cases, out of them in particular, and what we've come to expect out of them. So from that perspective, I can't really disagree with the idea that if there is going to be a down week for Hunter, this is likely to be that down week.
Yeah, that Lions offensive line is something to behold. Sewell is crazy good. Those numbers I was talking about, hasn't allowed more than 2 pressures or a single sack this season is just insane. Watch him allow 3 to Hunter this weekend. now I've jinxed it. So Scott, DBs, which defensive back has you excited this week, and why?
Yeah, so going back to your Chargers, it's Elijah Molden, and I'm curious to hear what you think of this after I kind of lay out my case, because I don't watch a lot of Chargers games. I do a lot of red zone when the Bengals aren't playing, so I get bits and pieces, but Scott Hansen really needs to do a better job of highlighting all the sacks and all the nice PBUs and all the other things beyond just the big offensive plays, if I can give him any advice whatsoever from an IDP narrative perspective. But Molden, the Chargers have been running out 3 safeties very heavily these past 2 weeks. Between Molden, James, and Gilman, they've all played at least 86% of the snaps each of the last 2 weeks. I don't know how much they're going to be varying the game script from week to week, which is why if you dump cold water on this one, I completely understand. But when he plays, he's playing very well. I was surprised to see, I knew he was playing well. I didn't know how well he was playing. Because I remember in MFL, at least when he was first drafted, he was a corner. And so I look at a few of my rosters. I'm like, oh, yeah, he's a safety now. I don't know how much I love that, because sometimes, that's not a good signal. But he has been playing incredibly well. He's PFF safety 5 on the season, and that's on 350 snaps. So that's not like he's only gotten a little bit of action here and there, because sometimes those small sample sizes can skew things a little bit. And he produces when he plays. Like all players, snap shares are king. I know you were talking about with linebackers earlier. That's the number one thing that probably all of us model whenever we look at any kind of position. But in just looking at his snap shares, it just speaks to how powerful this correlation can be. So I'm going to throw a lot of numbers out, but I think the point is going to be very well taken. Week 1, 33%, 1 fantasy point. Week 2, 100%, 20 fantasy points. Week 3 down to 47, only 4 points. Then up to 98, 19. 65, 19. 25%, 2 points. 86%, 9. 90%, 21. So he is not just playing well when he gets to play, but when he gets the snap shares, he only has one game that if you're mapping this out as an actual correlation, that would be like dipping a little bit below that line of what we would expect him to be able to do. Otherwise, he's producing on the field. He's producing from a fantasy perspective. He does play a lot of free safety, which I know we tend to not really move towards from a fantasy perspective. But if you're someone who's been producing even from that role, and he does rotate in a little bit, he's getting about 10 snaps per game over the past few weeks in either a box or a slot role. He did have that experience playing slot corner, as I think what he was projected as coming out of college. So I like him this week as much as you can like any defensive back, because we know there's so much variability in that position. I recognize this isn't the best matchup for safeties, the Titans, from a fantasy perspective, but I think the talent is there. And if they keep this deployment of all three at 80, 86% or higher, I think Molden can be in a prime position to continue to score.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with any of that. Actually, I expected to, but you've covered some of the or kind of preempted some of the slight concerns I had, like the matchup. You know, the Titans are a terrible matchup for safeties, but yeah, everything else that you said is something that I'm in sync with. You know, I love how his role has grown. You mentioned how well he's been playing. I love how well he's playing. He looks like doesn't he look like a completely different guy to the guy we've seen in Tennessee over the last 3 seasons? Maybe it is an alignment thing. He's almost exclusively playing as a deep safety, which he's never done in the 3 seasons prior. Maybe it's one of those things where some guys just really suit a particular scheme. I don't know. Maybe he's just become a much better player overnight. Either way, there's a lot to like about what we're seeing. And yeah, like you say, deep safeties aren't always the most attractive. There's always a few exceptions to that rule. The Minkas, the Jesse Bateses, thinking in seasons past more so than in this season. But Molden, yeah, he's playing really well. His role has grown. He's producing. Maybe if I had a concern, would it be that some of his production, some of his value has been tied to the big plays, which we know can be a little bit streaky at times. It's not a reason enough for me to disagree with your point. I don't think, because 3 interceptions is not a crazy high number so far this season. So yeah, I really like what we're seeing from Molden.
Yeah, and in terms of the Titans, it is a tough matchup in terms of sort of those boom games. But again, when I do any sort of playing with no position left behind with DT premium, a little bit of juice in corners and safeties, at least in tackles relative to linebackers, looking at those kinds of leagues, the Titans have been allowing viable safety performances. They haven't been allowing great safety performances. So they're not a matchup that you want to target. But each of the past 4 weeks, I like to think of 10 points as the floor that I want to get out of any of my IDP starters. I know if they all score that, I'm going to be in trouble. But I know that if they score less than that, I'm going to be in a lot more trouble. Over the past 4 weeks, they've allowed 2 10-point safeties per game. So I don't think they've allowed any 20-point safeties. So there's a really small variance. But I think that there are going to be enough points to go around where, if he gets that interception that puts him up closer to that 20-point, fantastic. But if he doesn't, there's enough. I'm trying to think of the metaphor I want to use. There's enough juice to be squeezed out of the Titans' offense to help safeties, even if it doesn't fill the whole cup. I don't know. I'm kind of going forward with that now. But it's not a great matchup, but it's a fine enough matchup.
That's a really good point, Scott. I'm really glad you made it, because I've just gone back to revisit. And yes, the Titans have been one of the worst matchups for opposition safeties so far this season. But under Rudolph, they're allowing 12.7 tackles per game on average over the last 3 since Rudolph's been starting. Whereas under Levis, it was much lower than that, 12.7 near the league average. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Thanks for that. That's really insightful. I consider myself schooled. So, yeah, my guy here. And I was going to mention Jordan Battle at one point. His role increased significantly in week 9, but it's not yet where we want it to be. It could be this season, so this week even, but it's not yet there. So instead, I've gone with Kerby Joseph. Joseph has been insanely good this season. One of the best NFL and fantasy DBs in 2024. We know his interception rate is unlikely to continue. It's otherworldly, 6 in the last 8. That's obviously going to decrease, right? But that's not the main reason for his nomination. It's more of a matchup-based choice here. And the Lions play the Texans this week, and the Texans have allowed the most tackles to opposition safeties of any team in the league. They're also top 3 in tackle efficiency, allowed 2. So for those reasons, I'm leaning towards Joseph. Now, as I say, those 6 interceptions are really good. We know he's not going to lose his role as well because he's been playing really well in other aspects of the game as well. In run defense, he doesn't miss a lot of tackles. It's like 8-point-something% missed tackle rate. He's a bit like Molden for me in the sense that he's taken his game to a whole new level, seemingly overnight, from one season to the next. Can't really put my finger on why, but it's great to see. Not expecting the interception rate to continue, but the matchup's great in terms of potential tackle production.
Yeah, and he plays 100% of snaps, in all but 2 weeks. And I think those 2 weeks he maybe missed 3 total snaps. So I know that with safeties and with some corners, you see that more so than with where I spend most of my time on the defensive line. But still, I think when you get into the talent and the situation, he's PFF's #1 rated safety for the season among qualifying players so far this year. So the talent is absolutely there. The Lions, I think that matchup is going to be a fun matchup, not just for fantasy, but also just a fun matchup to watch. So I'm looking forward to tuning into that one with the Texans. So yeah, I agree. Kerby Joseph, if I had him anywhere, I would be very happy that I do, and especially excited for this week. Unfortunately, he's someone that I don't have anywhere, so I'll just have to root from afar.
Yeah. And it's beyond the scope of this show, but if I had him somewhere, it might surprise some. I will be looking to try and trade him at the moment. What do you think about that, Scott?
I like old safeties, so I tend to trade away any youth at safety. Sometimes it bites me. I traded away Antoine Winfield. Granted, I had a good return, and I can't remember if I used the pick as well as I should have that I got from him, but I do like to churn safeties in particular because you always have those veterans out there like Harrison Smith and Honey Badger, Tyrann Mathieu, even guys like Jalen Thompson, who's very under the radar in Arizona, who can all tend to score for you. And you also have people emerge every season seemingly out of nowhere. Thinking Jordan Howan had some really nice performances for the Saints, and I don't think was projected to be a starter coming into the year, but I've noticed his production has ticked back up. So it feels like if you can ever trade away a safety for a good return, I am usually more than happy to do it. I don't update my trade bait to have my safeties always there, but though that is a position, I'm less likely to move edges, less likely to move linebackers. Not because I don't think you can't stream edge. I think you can, but streaming edge is more difficult because so many of them tend to be rostered. In most leagues, you're going to be able to find starting safeties out there, starting defensive tackles out there, starting corners out there for sure. So I think, he would be a good trade candidate, especially if you have a Lions fan in your league who knows just how good he's been playing too beyond the fantasy stuff. Or if you have someone who's only a box score watcher and sees, oh, look at all these points and don't realize he has 6 interceptions. That would be another good, potential trade partner.
Yep. His value could never be, or may never be, higher than it is right now. So, so DB dislikes, Scott. Give me a name. Give a man a name, any name, and extra points if you get the TV reference there as well.
I did. So Quan Martin for me. This is someone who, I'll be honest, wasn't really on my radar as a significant play coming into the season, but he has commanded that safety 2 role in Washington, so he plays. He's out there, and if you're someone who does follow snap counts, which is a good thing to follow in terms of taking cues for who to play and who not to play, you might be interested in Martin. If you just watched 2 weeks ago when he led the Commanders in tackles with 11 against the Bears, you might be someone who's interested in Martin. However, last week against the Giants, in what I understand was a very bizarre game with them refusing to throw a forward pass for almost the entirety of the first half. He recorded 3 tackles in the whole of that game, even after the Giants did start passing a little bit more once they realized that they needed to do that from time to time, at least. But if you look at his production as well, he lines up in the free safety position more often than not with Chin, eating up those box snaps. But he has played significantly more box snaps than Elijah Molden, who I was just talking about. He has 140 more defensive snaps than Molden, but in no position left behind scoring, he is half of a point behind Molden in terms of fantasy scoring. So he just has not been a reliable fantasy asset, even though he's getting the snaps. And then if you look at the matchup, granted, this is probably talking to a very niche part of the audience who was like, man, I'm really excited about Quan Martin this week. But if you were, just temper those expectations because they're playing the Steelers this week. And since Russell Wilson has taken over, again, small sample size, but in those 2 games, they've allowed the least fantasy points across the league to opposing safeties. They've allowed 1 10-point safety performance across the 4 starting safeties in those 2 games. And so the Steelers have just been a terrible safety matchup since Wilson has taken charge. So Martin might be a good stream at some points in time if you are someone who punted safety, and hopefully you can catch those more Bears kind of weeks. But this week has all the appearances of more like a Commanders week with maybe 3 combined tackles. And so he's someone who I don't like all that much this week.
Right there with you. I'm not touching Martin. Two productive weeks in 9, 2 games with 7 or more tackles, and 6 games with 5 or less. Mm-hmm. I don't want to lean too heavily into looking at the big play production. We mentioned earlier that can be streaky, but it just hurts his stock even more that he's done nothing, absolutely nothing in that sense either. 1 pass breakup really outside of the tackles. So yeah, I'm as I say, I'm not touching Martin.
Yep.
My dislike, Scott, is Vonn Bell, and this one's pretty simple because while I mentioned Battle's role hasn't increased to the level where I'm happy nominating him as my like this week, he has eaten sufficiently into Bell's role that I can't rely on Bell any longer. In week 9, Bell played 49% of the defensive snaps at a new season low by some margin. It was previously 83%. Even so, I did pause for a moment when I did notice the Bengals have the Ravens this week. They've been a positive matchup for opposition safeties in terms of tackle production this year. But then I kind of came to my senses, Scott, and I remembered we've got loads of choices at DB, and I have absolutely no business starting a guy who plays half the snaps or less if this trend continues. So can I assume that you're on board with me with this one?
I am, and I'm a huge Bengals fan, and as much as I liked Vonn Bell and what he did for us a few years ago, Battle played well, and I didn't really understand. Like Geno Stone, we absolutely needed another safety to be back there after losing Jesse Bates and Vonn Bell. But the role that Battle has played this season, I'm surprised it took this long for him to start to eat into the snap share. But it seems like it is absolutely happening there, that Vonn Bell is not the Vonn Bell from just 2 years ago. And again, super grateful for his role in that Super Bowl run, but it's not 2021 anymore. And so I think we need to turn the page. And I do have Bell in a couple of places, even in some like modified best ball leagues where I can keep extra players active and deactivate others, which is really fun for trying to guess some boom weeks in addition to safe plays. I'm not touching Bell even in that format this week. That snap share is just way too alarming for my taste. And again, the play of Battle, if they had nobody else there, it'd be one thing. Like we were talking about the Rams linebacker room. If there was no depth at all in Cincinnati at safety, it'd be one thing. But because there is depth there, I agree. Bell is a pretty clear fade for me this week too.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Okay, Scott, that is a wrap for the Week 10 IDP preview episode of the IDP After Show. That is a bit of a mouthful at first. Scott, you've been a truly excellent guest. We thank you very much for coming on and sharing your thoughts with us all. I know I alluded earlier, and you mentioned to a certain weekly article that you create for the IDP Show. Tell us a little bit more about that and remind our audience where they can find you and your content this season.
Yeah, so every week I highlight 12 defensive line streamers, 6 defensive tackles, 6 defensive ends, just in case you're in a league that has all 5 positions as it should be, but that's a platform for another day. I really am a fan of the defensive line position, and I think that there are a lot of good streaming options out there, especially when you look at defensive tackle, but there are also some viable ones for defensive end as well. So I really wanted this to have some unique value. And so I'm only looking at defensive ends and defensive tackles that are available in 70% or more or 90% or more of my fantasy leagues, IDP leagues in particular. So each week I highlight those 12 names. I give out a little bit of rationale for each. I'm, an academic researcher by trade, so I give you a lot of transparency. I talk about which of my metrics are performing well in the model. I go through past week's performance about what was successful, what wasn't, what we can learn from that in terms of informing future decision making. So that's usually out every Wednesday, unless I'm traveling or something else is going on. But I've really, really enjoyed that exercise. It's been difficult, especially with the defensive ends, given how many even mediocre defensive ends are rostered at higher than that 25% rate that's been my threshold. But still, it's been a good time. So I've been enjoying that. You can find it on the IDP Show. I also run the State of IDP survey to try to collect data on as many IDP leagues as possible to share that information back out, not just with the site, but with everybody. I share that data available publicly to help anyone who's trying to generate content, to help fantasy managers be able to do that better, to give commissioners and fantasy players ideas for other ways that IDP leagues are structured in case something really gathers your interest. And there's a link to that at the bottom of all of my articles. And you can find me occasionally on Twitter, not very often, but occasionally on Twitter at Professor IDP, and sometimes I'll do some stuff on Reddit as well. But that's where you can find me. Mostly on the idpshow.com is where you'll find my articles, and always respond to comments when I get them. So happy to help however I can.
Good stuff. I mean, there you have it. If it wasn't already obvious, having heard Scott talk on the show tonight, he is an incredibly clever guy, and you're doing yourself a massive disservice by not reading his content. So go and read it, go and follow him, and subscribe to our audience. Tonight's show, thank you for dropping by, whether you're listening on Spotify or Apple or watching us on YouTube. A big thanks for checking us out. I say it every week, and I'll continue to do so because your support is very much appreciated. And it has been a few weeks since I did it last, but I also want to spare a second to give a mention to the team at the IDP Show who make this happen. So Josh, Nicola, and my guests like Scott, you guys rock. I want to say a big thanks to you all too. We will be back with this, our guest interview feed next week with the Week 11 preview of the IDP After Show. So please don't forget to subscribe to our channels to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes. And if you're feeling generous, drop us a like or a rating on whatever platform you're listening. In the meantime, the very best of luck with your Week 10 matchups, and bye for now.